look at your team. It isn't all about the 10.
They should be under a little bit of heat at the minute. Next season, the pressure will be even greater.
And that's the big question mark. Yeah, and maybe it is a thing with them as well, without speaking for them, is where does the URC fit in terms of ambition at the start of the year? And I know the answer to the question, right? So if you think of all them Irish players in that team, you've got the World Cup, then you've got the Six Nations Grand Slam, and then you've got the Champions Cup, then you've got URC. Like, so it's fourth down the line. Naturally, of course it is, because for anyone it would be fourth down that line. And then you, to make a final, have got to go to South Africa, got to go to altitude. You have the travel, you have the upset and the mental heartache for, well, you got one of those four because you won the Six Nations. And I don't want to go harsh on that, so it's really hard. I think it's worse being in the position that they're in, having made the finals and made the semi-finals and not come through it, than getting the wooden spoon and you're just a shit team. You know, like you're a shit team and that's it. Like you are a shit team, or anything is an overachievement. And I suppose being in that high performance environment where everything is so good, you're looked after as a player, financially you're paid very well. You've got superstar players coming in like RG Snyman, Geordie Barrett, and these guys that can do special things. But I imagine that pressure can be crippling at points.
Well, it's only going to build and build. And the bottom line is they're not going to be able to, they're almost not going to be able to release that pressure for another 12 months because they're not going to have they can't play in a final for another 12 months now, or they're not going to have the option to play in a final, or get to a final or a semi-final, or whatever. So it's almost like, Leinster blitz the league normally. I know this year they end up finishing third, which is why they had to go to Pretoria on the weekend. Now, for me, I'd look at sort of maybe other games around that Champions Cup game. I know they lost to Ulster, didn't they? They lost to Ulster just before the European semi or final a few weeks ago. And all of a sudden, you think normally in years gone by, whatever team Leinster send, they just get the job done somewhere like that, don't they? Generally. Whereas I think for me, the whole focus this year, after losing the last two finals to La Rochelle in the Champions Cup, everything was poured into that final. So all of a sudden then you fall short in that game that your whole seasons are based around. And it's so difficult for a player. Physically it's easy to recover from bumps and, turn injuries around, or if your body's tired or whatever, it's easy for big matches. But mentally, it is absolutely draining to just keep getting yourself back up and up and up off the back of disappointments. A little bit like I felt it when we lost to Argentina in the World Cup in the quarterfinals, and it did, like I didn't, my body was fine. Body felt fine. No issues with that. We'd had a tough campaign, but like the body was fine. But mentally, I couldn't think of anything worse than watching a game of rugby or going into training or thinking about what the next tactics are for the next game and stuff like that. But physically, I was fine. But I think that's the problem that Leinster were probably going to have at the minute, is that they put so much into that final, and to come up short again looks as if they've had a bit of a hangover off it. And this is, when have you ever seen Leinster finish third in the league?
I feel a bit contradictory now because I've spoken about Jamison Gibson Park, about being freed up. You think how good he was at the early part of the season as well, because Johnny wasn't there, who was controlling it. And then there's a part of me now thinking the missing link is someone like a Johnny Sexton. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's been tough for Ross Byrne, isn't it? And again, he's taking some criticism, and it's not an easy job filling in or stepping into Johnny Sexton's boot either. So we talk about pressure on teams and in finals and big matches, but the pressure he's got is different almost, because every time he steps on a training field, or every time he calls a call, or every time he passes a ball, kicks a ball, he's always being compared to Johnny. And that's probably unfair, because Johnny's probably a once-in-a-generation player in terms of what Ireland have produced and what he produced for Leinster and Ireland. But there's no doubt that they look like they're missing someone like Johnny to drag that team forward a little bit at the minute. And as good, like you said, Jim, as good as what Jamison Gibson Park's been, as good as what Doris has been, James Lowe, these guys, what Johnny's best characteristic and his biggest strength was just the will and the fight and the quality that he brought to that team. And it looks as if they're probably a little bit short in that department at the minute. I mean, Ross is, look at what Ross has won and how many games he's played, etc., etc. But he just looks a little bit at the minute, and it's probably indicative of where Leinster are at, that they've just come up short in big games and in small margins. You look at your key players, don't you? You look at your 9s, your 10s, your number 8s maybe, and you just think, well, have they come up a little bit short? And the answer would probably be, from Ross's point of view, a fraction short. But it's probably that the fact that Leinster are missing a Johnny Sexton type figure at 10 to get them over the line, and maybe these big games as well.
Yeah, that's the thing with the 10, right? And you'll know better than anyone. Everything's about the quarterback who's making the plays. The highest profile players generally are around 10. But my argument would be to some people where they say about Ross Byrne or like a Harry Byrne or whoever is in that 10 position that's going to take over from Johnny. You look at Glasgow. Glasgow's 10's Tom Jordan. Mate, he's a wicked player, but everything isn't revolving around him because you've got Sione Tuipulotu, you've got Hugh Jones, you've got, even the Munster centres are brilliant as well, who've been fantastic all season as well. Yes, there's an argument for the Irish fans to say, oh, Ross Byrne isn't Johnny Sexton, he isn't this, he isn't that. But then the other argument is okay, you're missing Johnny Sexton, but look at the players that you've got. You've got Robbie Henshaw, Gary Ringrose, who was wicked again at the weekend, especially in defence. You've got James Lowe, you've got Hugo Keenan, you've got Jimmy O'Brien, who's been unbelievable. You've got like a star-studded team from 1 to 35 or 1 to 40, better than any team. So there's a part of me that's like, yeah, I can see that. He's not Johnny Sexton. Is he the weak link across the Leinster backline? There's an argument for that. But the other one would be like, look at your team. It isn't all about the 10. It is like Johan Goosen, who for the Bulls was fantastic, scored a wicked try at the weekend. But it was Willie LaRue like coming into that 10 and putting the crossfields in. So I think it's being in that 10 position in Ireland, Biggs, and you'll know, or not even just Northern Hemisphere. New Zealand, they'll have the same thing around Richie Mwanga and Bowden Barrett when he's in that position as well. South Africa, Andre Pollard, Manny Lebok, whoever it is. England, the same, Marcus Smith. Owen Farrell, does he come back? George Ford, Finn Smith. Like, the list is endless. So maybe it is that position in 10 where the microscope is on, Biggs.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, playing 10 for Wales for 15 years, Jim, I reckon I've had maybe 1 or 2 good games from people's opinions in 15 years. So and 1 or 2 maybe stretching it as well. Honestly, mate, it's brutal. It's really, really brutal because, again, like you said, everyone, it's a little bit like if you're, I don't know, your number 9 in football isn't scoring you goals, but he's getting no crosses put in, no service provided for you, etc., etc., etc. Now, if you're in a team which is getting beat up front, your 9 and 10 generally aren't going to have as good a games as if you're playing for a team who are absolutely flying. But I think where you do learn a lot about those types of 10s and players is when the game doesn't go your way and you're in a scrap and you're in those tight games, is how do you get your team over the line? And generally that is what I suppose your 9 and 10's job is. And that's why it's such a high profile position. That's why it's such a high profile position. And also that's why it's generally number 10 is probably the most well paid position, because you're under a huge amount of scrutiny and you have to find a way in close games to get your team over the line. And there's an argument, like you said, that stepping into Johnny's shoes for someone like Ross Byrne is a huge task and will add pressure in an already pressured position. But also, like you said, Jim, he's got some pretty good weapons at his disposal to use as well in that team. And they've got to look at why they haven't got over the line in those last few games. And I will say that the games that they've lost, generally it's been against, like we spoke about, teams that can just match that Leinster physical battle. If you match that, and you match that against Ireland or Leinster, whoever it is, Munster, like Glasgow did on the weekend, then it's a far more difficult game for those Irish teams, because they're so used to just winning that battle after battle after battle. And teams that they've lost to in these big games, you look at the Bulls, you look at La Rochelle, you look at Toulouse. I mean, teams that can just spit you up and chew you up and spit you out. So it's kind of like a little bit hard, I think, on Ross, but there's no doubt that probably in some of those close games, he's probably, between him and Gibson Park and the 9, they've probably just got to find a way to get over the line, and that's when your 9 and 10 probably come under a little bit of heat. But we're speaking about Leinster here as if they're an average team. They've still reached ridiculous heights, haven't they, really, in the last couple of years when you look at it. But when you are as well resourced and as well funded, and I suppose the standards that they've set, then you're going to be judged different to a Glasgow, for argument's sake, to an Edinburgh, to a, I don't know, even a Munster type of thing, in a way. Do you know what I mean? They're going to be judged very, very different. It's almost like Man City at the minute. Man City have won the league the last 4 years, haven't they? And you think, well, that's right, because they've got the best players and they probably pay them the most money. So you think Leinster are in a similar boat to that. Leinster have got the best players in the league. I don't think anybody could argue with that, could they? I think that's I know we've got some fabulous South African players and fabulous players in that league, but on the whole, I think that squad is as strong as anything in the league. So all of a sudden, then you think, well, you've got to get over the line and you've got to get the job done. And if you don't, then you shouldn't be immune to criticism or pressure coming from within or outside the camp as well. I think it's a very valid point that they should be under a little bit of heat at the minute, and I think that with that they've got a big task ahead of them. And next season the pressure will be even greater for them to go and get a trophy in the bag off the back of 3 or 4 pretty average years by their standards.
Yeah, it's also set up the summer tour down to South Africa. And we were going back and forth on voice notes, weren't we, about the physicality of the breakdown. And that was brought into the conversation after the game. And I love that part of the game, especially now that the crop roll isn't there. And there were some massive collisions, like around the clear-outs and the scrum. We can touch on the scrum. That's where Leinster struggled as well. I thought there was a few penalties that the referee left behind in not favouring the Bulls for the dominance. But the physicality, and that's the big question mark that has been there around, if you want to call it a slight Achilles heel, when you're looking for a weakness in the Ireland and Leinster, has been around scrum and has been around physicality. And Bernard Jackman spoke about it before, the likes of the fact that they are so all over Joe McCarthy, and rightly so, because he's a physical specimen. And without drawing comparisons to the South Africans, but you have to because they're the best in the world, like he is from that ilk in terms of thick, in terms of dense, how he cleans bodies at the breakdown. But that has built the narrative towards this summer tour. And I wonder how they go in. I know they go in, they're hungry and they're going to be with Andy Farrell, but it has lined up nicely, especially with the injuries that South Africa have got and the fact that they're the world champions. Like, what kind of nick are they in? Are they in a rebuild? But that's the one. That's the summer series that a lot of people will be interested in.
It's going to be so good, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't, with all the needle that's between the two teams, with some of the comments from sort of Deolande, from Etzebev, it's got theatre around it, hasn't it, as well? It's kind of got the best two teams probably in the world, just going at it for its summer series. It's going to be, and quite often these summer series are always, I'd say always, they're quite often, they're about, can we find some new players? Can we, do we change our style of play? They're kind of at the end of a season, you kind of think, there's not a huge amount on them over the last few years. But you look at this one in particular in Ireland and South Africa, and it just sets it up. It's a huge summer, and I think both teams really want to win, which isn't always the case in those summer games. Sometimes it's a bit like, yeah, okay, well, if you get a result, then great. It's not the end of the world if you lose a game there. But I think this summer really matters to both teams. And you look at the amount of South African injuries, that would be a concern. I think if you're Razzie right now, you'd be looking at a lot of your frontline players have picked up injuries. But I suppose what they've been so good at is their strength and depth and the amount of players that they can just call on and bring in. And go back to that type of power game. We just spoke about Cameron Hannigan, and just like if there's an injury crisis maybe in the back row, for argument's sake, then you've got this guy to come in who's absolutely tearing up trees. So I think both teams, in terms of Ireland and South Africa, are equipped because they've got so many players, so many good players playing at such high level. It's just sets it up brilliantly. And I think, again, whoever wins that physical battle in those games in July is going to come out victorious. But I do think Ireland, when they go into camp, they'll know that, with Andy Farrell, with the systems they've got in place there, I think off the back of winning the championship back in the Six Nations, I think they'll still fancy themselves and will back themselves to get a result. But it sets it up brilliantly, and it's got, like I said, it's got some theatre, it's got a bit of drama around it, and should be a brilliant test series.
Pod.
Rugby Pod.